So welcome everyone to this really interesting sounding presentation. I'm really looking forward to it. So the seminar is being live streamed for off-campus postgraduate students, staff, and other interested people. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions if you're here live at the end of the presentation, which is scheduled to be at 1:30. So we'll have half an hour for questions if we need them. If we have them. The session is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the departmental website once it's been edited. So if you don't want to be seen, then keep your camera off. And for now, because you keep both your camera off and your microphone muted, please. Okay, so that just leaves me to introduce Ola, who is my supervisee, my doctoral supervisee. I'm very pleased to say. And today I'm going to leave her to talk about the detail, but she's talking about inclusion policies in universities and looking at it through a couple of interesting lenses that one of which was new to me, so I've found it very interesting looking at her work on this. So thanks very much for today, Ola, and over to you.
Thank you, Professor Paul, and thank you very much for the guidance that you offered me throughout the journey of this research. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be with you to present my research today on the agenda setting of Egypt's inclusion policy making process in higher education institutions. And I have to admit that I specifically here focus on the agenda setting because it's the first step in any policy making process and the most influential in the makeup of any successful policy. So I'm moving on to the study overview next, please, and the purpose. So basically, the purpose of my research is to examine how the nature of the three streams of inclusion, the problem, policy, and politics, shapes the development and outcome of the inclusion policies and or practices, determining the advancement of some institutions over the others. And next, the issue that this study seeks to address is basically inclusive educational environment in Egyptian higher education institutions is measured by its level of alignment with the global conventions and goals that supposedly respond to all dimensions of social environment. Yet what I've witnessed in higher education institutions and as an instructor, and also what is evidenced in the literature, that students are still facing multiple forms of exclusion. And this results from three things. First, the absence of social inclusion policies, which loosens the opportunity of standardizing the resources and the accommodations needed, and or the ever-expanding failure of inclusion practices and policies to close the gap between what is intended to be done and what is done on ground. And third, the social practice severity that disempower the students. Besides, although the pattern of inclusive education has globally changed from only accessibility to solidarity, the students are facing these complexities on multivariate levels. So that's why I decided to use the multiple streams framework supported by the socio-ecological framework to see or to examine and understand the variations that affect the inclusion aspects and on whether or not it will be added to the agenda setting of the policymakers. Next. So my selection of the multiple streams framework was built on the fact that it doesn't see the agenda setting as a linear traditional process, yet it sees it as a collision of three streams, the problems, policies, and politics, all of which are decision aspects in the policy process. The framework suggests that while the three streams may be operating independently of one another, and while all three need to come together to open a window for a policy to emerge, still this policy may not occur if policy entrepreneurs did not seek the opportunity of an opened window. And that's why, because the multiple streams framework was criticized in the literature by disregarding the ecological ambiguities, the complex systems effects, and the policy monopolies, I decided to theorize the socio-ecological framework to consider the complex interplay between different levels. So next, please. So yeah, this is an overall illustration of the design of this empirical exploratory research, showing the needed relations between the theoretical framework, research design, and the expected outputs. And we will go into details in every one. Next, please. Yeah, so I landed on 4 research questions. Next, please. The first research question is focusing on the definition of the inclusion. The second research question, next, please, is focusing on the possible solutions. And the third on the politics that affect the problem. And the fourth on the advantages that multiple streams framework approach offers for the higher education institutions in Egypt. I tailored semi-structured interview guide and a focus group script, and I piloted them before the data collection phase. Next. So the study contributes to the literature on the micro, meso, and macro levels through specifying the elements that influence the build-up of inclusion aspects, their convergence and effects. The significance of this study from an academic lens is in advancing the multiple streams framework by bringing the socio-ecological framework theorizing into dialogue. And this study's output is expected, hopefully, to be used by policymakers when developing inclusion policies later on. Next, please. So the study was, thank you. The study was conducted in Egypt. It's a developing country with over 100 million population. Estimates, according to the statistical data available, that there is around 11 people with disabilities in Egypt, 11%, sorry, people of disabilities living with disabilities. The study was conducted in 4 higher education institutions in Egypt, and I was eager to make sure or to set 2 criteria in my selection. First, to have both public and private universities, and within each type to have one that has an inclusion policy and one doesn't. And I have to highlight here that the public universities selected, the 2 ones selected were the 2 oldest public universities in Egypt, and the 2 private universities. One was led by the Sustainable Development Strategies, and the other was led by the Liberal Arts. Next, please. So as seen in the overall study diagram, the study deployed 3 methods designed to inform each other. So the document analysis sets initial definitions, then the in-depth interviews come to clarify the reflected views supported by reviewed documents, and finally the focus group discussions verify the truthfulness of collected data and identify any perceptional gaps. I had the purpose of samples, so I had basically 5 categories. First, the staff from public authorities mandated with the policies and the governing of the universities. Second, policy entrepreneurs who are expertise in specific area, politically connected, governmental or non-governmental, deploying their personal resources to defend their ideas against specific benefits. I have also policymakers or internal stakeholders who shape the organizational traits in the institutions. And I have professors and I have students with disabilities and without disabilities. And it's worth noting here that I focus specifically on 2 impairments, the visual impairment and the physical impairment, and because simply these are the ones who are dominant in the higher education institutions. The IDIs and focus group discussions were facilitated by myself as the lead researcher, and I audio recorded after taking permissions using the Zoom video communication software due to the global pandemic. I took notes of the session as well as some highlights to back up the recording. Some definitions and comparative models were discussed at the beginning or at the initial discussion just to make sure that we're on the right track. Next, please. So, thank you. For the data analysis, I used the Atlas software. I started by developing the code book, and I used the deductive approach. So most of the definitions and the codes were deducted from the literature. And later on, I used the inducative to add to the codes through the perceptions of the respondents. I started by the open coding. So I added the codes and definitions, and then this was followed by the axial coding where I connected these codes. Next, please. So the literature, next, please. I had 4 sections in the literature. The theoretical framework was the first section. The second was the inclusion. Second, please. And then I had the barriers in higher education. And then I had Egypt research setting. So I will run you very quickly through the highlights of the literature. The first, the theoretical framework. Next, please. Okay, thank you. Next, please. So the theoretical framework, I had three issues that I focused on: the disability models, and we had the medical model and the social model. The medical model, where the individual or the student with disability has to accommodate for the community, and the social model, where the community has to accommodate the students with disabilities. I also looked into the framework supporting disability. Next, please. So, yeah, thank you. I started with the Sustainable Development Goals, and across the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I discovered there is only one addressing disability in education, yet it focuses on accessibility and infrastructure. So, and then we have the SDG number 10 and 17. 10 is focusing on inclusion for all, and 17 is focusing on the disaggregated data of the disabled people. I also looked into the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I discovered that there is 2 articles that is very much relevant to this study. So we have article number 24, which define the disability according to the impairment type and the community acceptance. And they have also article number 33, which provides a comprehensive national level implementation outline, guiding the countries to be substantial of the modification of their laws and practices. I also looked into the Special Educational Needs and Disability Framework, the SEND framework. And although Egypt is not part of this framework yet, it was very useful to examine it because it gives a new vision of how or who should be treated differently in higher education institutions. And it actually gave or highlighted 2 variables: the person's performance and the availability of facilities in higher education. So these are the 2 measures that SEND focus on in regards to the special education needed. And I also looked into the International Classification of Functionality, Disability, and Health. And again, this gives a mix of the individual, the social, and the environment, and it totally aligns with the socio-ecological model. And finally, I looked into the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and unlike all other frameworks, this act focused on 4 components to support inclusion. So it started with parents' involvement, community awareness, and the inclusion and alignment, of across all educational levels. Next, please. So I looked also into the policy making and the different approaches beside the multiple streams framework. And I discovered that the success of the policy making in all approaches has to do with the policymakers' awareness of the context. So this was something that was common across all the approaches. And it was also interesting to find that resilience to inclusion is likely to happen at the micro level. So again, this is something that was mostly common across approaches. So this was the first section in the literature. The second section is inclusion. So next, please. So yeah, inclusion is covering 3 points. First is the explosion of inclusion. And it was interesting to see that the concept of inclusion is being advanced from only segregation to integration to inclusion. Next, please. I also looked on inclusion as a practice of excellence. And it was interesting to see that for inclusion to be a practice of excellence, universities need to be aware of the context and including into their plans. And also they need to make the resources available and to increase the awareness of the communities on different levels. I also looked into, next please, the inclusive education. So for inclusive education, I needed to investigate the transportability of context into the policymaking process. In the literature, we have different frameworks for transportability. The most relevant for this study is the contextual factor framework, which comes in full alignment with the socio-ecological framework, both of which underline the culture's role, implications, and the interconnectedness on the value system of any place. So causation is evidenced between the culture's complex, multidimensional aspects and the policymaking process. And that's why, as advised in the literature, the success here is to have continuous collaboration, learning, and adaptation mechanisms that enable the policymaking to be responsive enough to the context. So let's move on, please, to the third section of the literature. the barriers in higher education. Thank you. So by reviewing the literature, I discovered that the common barriers in higher education are conceptual, institutional, and teaching. So let's focus first on the conceptual. So the conceptual is basically resulting from the lack of collecting empirical evidence that enable institutions to build a live inclusion concept. And to avoid, can you next please? And to avoid this, we have to have a consistent evaluative evidence or practice. Next, please. For the institutional barrier, the institutional barrier actually results from not having the inclusion as a whole of an institution issue. And again, to avoid this, we need a value-driven participation from leaders on all levels to make sure that it's the job of everyone. Next, please. And for the teaching and learning barrier, there are 4 causes of this barrier: the misleading understanding of teachers' role, the pedagogical unawareness, the lack of infrastructure and facilities, and the personal attributes. But again, it was evidenced in the literature that the teacher's role is the most influential because it gives or it builds up the whole environment. So it was advised that teachers have to follow the constructivist theory, where they make the content life related and they allow the students to construct their own knowledge while they only facilitate the learning process for them. Next, please. So we're now reaching the last section in the literature, the Egypt research setting, and I focused here on 3 issues: the examined higher education institutions. Next, please. Yes, thank you. So, yeah, as we can see, public universities versus private universities. So in public universities, the professional development is not legally mandated, yet in private universities it is. In public universities, students with disabilities have limited choices across the arts track only, yet in private universities, they are free to choose whatever study or whatever program they would join. In public universities, students must pass the Central Medical Committee, and this committee decides on the list or it shortlists the faculties that they can choose among. Yet in private universities, students just meet the faculty's requirements. In public universities, students apply through a public office for coordination and admission. In the private universities, the students apply through the admission office directly. And in public universities, students benefit from different privileges. One only is provided through the Ministry of Higher Education, which is the tuition exemption, and the other is provided from the Ministry of Social Solidarity, the identification card and the monthly stipend, and if needed, the motorcycle fund. Yet in private universities, the benefits are totally different. So there is academic supporters, scholarships, infrastructure, and technological rehabilitation. Next, please. So the legal framework, I looked into the Egypt Sustainable Development Strategy, Egypt 2030 agenda, and this is some sort of national strategy that mirror the sustainable development goals. So it's comprised the same as the sustainable development goals of the social, economic, and environmental pillars. And among the social pillar, none of the objectives, neither the indicators cover the inclusion. I also looked into the National Scientific Research and Higher Education Sectoral Strategy, which is the sectoral strategy of higher education. And it's ruled by 8 values. None of them is relevant to inclusion. I also looked into the Egyptian Constitution, which clearly enforce and support inclusion, yet there are some, I would say, terminologies that was not defined. For example, enjoyment, reasonable accommodations, surrounding environment. So it leaves a room for everyone to translate it as they see. I also looked into the specified law for persons with disabilities, and I discovered that the concept goes for equality rather than equity. It contradicts with the university's organizing law because the persons with disabilities law promotes again or gives the students with disabilities the freedom to choose whatever faculties they want, yet the other university organizing law doesn't, and it specifies only the arts track. Also, this law stipulates a higher committee for students with disabilities right at higher education level with no operational manual, and it promotes for faculty professional development with no funds. I also looked into the National Council of Persons with Disabilities, which is assigned to develop a strategy for inclusion, same as the Ministry of Higher Education, yet this strategy was never drafted. Next, please. And finally, I tried to gather data about the students with disabilities in higher education institutions, but again, similar to many other countries, there's scarce of data on students with disabilities in higher education. So the only two info that I was able to find is that Egyptian youth segment 18 to 29 years old represents around 1.48 out of them is living with severe to profound disabilities, and 5.14 are living with mild to profound disability. The types of disabilities varies from blind, cognitive, deaf, psychological, physical, and mental. And it's interesting to see that although the blind are the least or the smallest percentage, yet they are the most dominant in higher education institutions. And it was also evidenced that higher education committee doesn't have any learning agenda or learning event or monitoring plan to see the progress of the inclusion in the institutions, and they lack resources for such accommodations. So let's move on to the findings. All the coming slides are categorized per research question and disaggregated per each ecological level. So the first one, as we said, we're focusing on the definition of the problem. Next, please. So as we can see, there are common issues on the intrapersonal level. Respondents' belief system influenced their thoughts, and this is very common and accepted. There are few respondents who can focus on the cause and effect or the causality of what they are doing. But in general, across the 4 universities, students perceive themselves as first category students in only one private university. Otherwise, they either consider themselves as second category or as a burden on the community. Students without disabilities felt empathy towards students with disabilities in 3 out of 4 universities, with the exception of private one, where they felt them as normal students. On the professors' level, in public universities in general, professors perceived students with disabilities as a burden who needs very much time, very much of their time, and consumes very much of their focus. While the private universities, they either saw them as motivators of change or similar to their counterparts. For policymakers, in public one, students with disabilities are not prioritized. In public two, they are prioritized, but only on the faculty level. And in the private universities, they are prioritized. For policy entrepreneurs, they agreed that in public universities, they struggle with setting intentional systemized planning to collect evidence of the importance of the issue. Yet in the private universities, the arrangements are way easier. For the public authority, they charged responsibility to the Ministry of Higher Education, and for the private, they work on reviewing the suggestions they receive from the private universities and respond to them accordingly. Next, please. So on the definition on the interpersonal level, so in general, students are, it was common to, we found it common that teacher assistants play essential role in supporting students with disabilities. In public universities, they do not necessarily provide, or they do not necessarily receive the needed professional development. So in some cases, they lack knowledge. In private universities, the case is different and they are fully engaged in training. Students in public one are not connected. They are not connected by any means. Student in public two, coincidentally, they, I would say, developed a WhatsApp group. So they are somehow connected and they make use of different experiences, paperwork, exemptions, and so forth. In the private universities, students with disabilities are fully engaged in the different networks, clubs, and unions. In regards to the extracurricular activities, in the private universities, they are fully engaged. In the public universities, it's limited to only very few, I would say, field trips and sports competitions. Next, please. So defining the problem also on the institutional level, we would find that the public one has no inclusion policy in place. The public two has an executive regulation for inclusion. In private one, it has an inclusion policy. Private two, it doesn't. So this affected actually the common understanding of inclusion, which is not available in public one, but in public two, because they found that the number of students with disabilities is really very high across the arts faculties. So one of the dean of these faculties initiated a network of art faculties, which helped them much to understand or to agree on a common understanding of inclusion and start somehow trying to standardize the services. In private one, there's common understanding across the faculties and the university, and same applies in private too. The students in the public universities, as mentioned earlier, they are only allowed to go or to admit and apply in only 5 faculties. And in the public one, they are also forced to go for the blended mode of study. So later on, if they are eligible to be a staff, they are not allowed because they are graduates of the blended mode. In the private universities, the case is different. They are allowed to go for any school they want. Public university one incubate definitely the medical model. Public two has the mix between the medical and the social model. The private universities totally goes for the social model. Actually, there was an initiative by the government 2 years ago to start establishing disability centers in the public universities. So the 2 public universities examined, they have this disability center, but it's operating much better in public 2 rather than public 1. In the private one, it has a special office, the well-being office for students with disabilities, and the private 2, although they do not have a specified office yet, because of the limited number of students they have, they study and review a case by case. No research is done in the public universities on inclusion, and no specified funds. Yet in the private universities, there are regular research on that, and there's dedicated funds, although not necessarily sufficient, but it's there. Next, please. So again, defining the problem on the community level, the campus in the public universities is downtown, and same applies for the housing. The private universities is far and isolated, and same applies for the housing. No mobility system in both public universities. Private one has a mobility system, yet private two does not. The accommodating infrastructure is not available in public one, with very few exceptions, individual initiatives in some very few faculties. Public two, it has, I would say, again, they've done some efforts to standardize the ramps, for example, but I wouldn't say that this is a maintenance for the needed infrastructure. In the private one and the private two universities, the campus totally ready for the students with disabilities. In the public universities, there is definitely a social stigma, and this was clear by all the respondents and agreed by all of them. In the private universities, private one, no social stigma. In private two, it's interesting to see that the social stigma depended on the socioeconomic background. So for the high wealth quintile, they had this a little bit social stigma, but the low wealth quintile, they felt more empathy and more supportive for students with disabilities. Next, please. So with, again, defining the problem on the policy level, so we have this issue of the laws, the contradicting laws. So the public universities are governed by the Persons with Disabilities law and the universities organizing law, which contradicts in terms of whether they can go for any faculty or those specified only in the arts track. And there is a public national authority that influences the policies in public universities. On the contrary, in private universities, private one is governed by the Americans with Disability Act. So it follows totally different dimensions. And it operates through a protocol with the Egyptian government. Again, this gives it very special arrangement. And it has also this public national authority that is specified for policies for private universities. In the private too, it's interesting also to see that although this is non-governmental authority or institution, yet because all the programs are credit hours, so it has this exemption from only accepting students with disabilities in the art track faculties. And it's also governed by this public national authority. Next, please. So now we're shifting our minds from defining the problem to finding the solutions or the expected solutions for this problem. Next, please. So solution on the intrapersonal level, it was interesting to see that the professors in Public One, they do not see that inclusion is within their mandate. And that's why they asked for a professional development program if inclusion was mandated. In the Public Two, professors blame the administration for not training them because, as mentioned earlier, they have this network for the arts faculties and they are trying to do their best and to learn from their experiences. But again, they feel that their funds and their time doesn't allow them to have or to organize this professional development thing. So they are blaming the administration. In the private one, they are mandatory, it's a mandatory to go attend and to take the trainings. So it's not optional. And in the private two, professors called for professional development if students with disabilities quantity increased. So up to now, they have only 6. Next, please. So solutions on the interpersonal level, professors building on the TA's role that we discussed earlier, in public universities, professors see that students with disabilities can build relations with TAs, not them, making use of their knowledge and time. In private universities, professors see the urge of having their own relations with students to better understand their needs and find solutions for them. Professors in public universities are hardly connected on the university's level. At the best, they get connected across few faculties or within one faculty. So they do not scaffold each other in regard to the needed accommodations. On the contrary, at private universities, professors have regular meetings that are not necessarily on inclusion aspects, but at least it's among their agenda. Also, the office hours dedicated by professors and influence on how students build a relation with them. So office hours in Public One is not used for these type of accommodations because they are consumed on other topics. In Public Two, they tried to increase the faculty hours to make sure that they are covering the inclusion issue, but it's not sufficient up till now. And in two, they have the dedicated. Next, please. Yeah, thank you. So solutions on the institutional level. It's interesting in this slide that we will find that the institutional suggested solutions are different among the 4 examined universities. Each reflect the challenges that they face. So professors in Public One called for curriculum update, curriculum exemption, and customized exams and enhanced infrastructure and ebooks, which they started in 2021 based on the need of the academic on the COVID pandemic. And policymakers also called for dedicated funds. In Public Two, because they have this network and they started initiating some good work on inclusion, they called for having statistical data on students with disabilities in universities, having it documented in a database that is managed by a results-based management system for inclusion. They also raised the issue of funding and of replicating the successful model of converting normal students' practicum hours to serve students with disabilities. So they had a very successful model in one of the faculties where they converted the practicum hours of normal students rather than of having field work to convert the hard books to ebooks. And this actually had a very good positive implication on the relation between students and on valuing the role of students with disabilities in higher education institutions. If we look into the private universities, we would find that the private one university, it was interesting to see that tailoring should not always focus on how things can be done in different ways. Should focus on how things can be done in different ways and not how to escape from doing things. And it was also interesting to see that all professors agreed that all students need accommodations, not only those with disabilities. And we heard also from many of them that students with disabilities sometimes refuse to benefit from the privileges that the university offer because they don't feel themselves less. In the private tour university, the professors asked for tailored assessment plans and for psychological support and enhanced life skills and competencies. And again, because this is the mindset of the sustainable development track, so they were very much concerned with the skills and competencies. Next, please. So solutions on the community level. It was interesting to see that professors in Public One called for the support of the NGOs, and policymakers called for a national survey on inclusion. What does it mean? What does it entail? What kind of funding it needs, and so forth. In Public Two, professors and policymakers came to an agreement that the community awareness is really important, and professors highlighted the positive impact of on-job modeling so then they have the students imitate their performance and make the culture more encouraging. In the private one, community is supported by NGOs and other private sector. And in the private two, they called for parents' role and the school awareness, and also for hosting role models. So again, in private two, they believe in that sharing the role models that was successful to complete the higher education and to join the labor market would help those currently studying to make it, and will also help professors and policymakers to understand what was needed at that point. Next, please. So solutions on the policy level. Social equity is a common goal across the 4 universities, that the application is not easy with the different constraints. In general, the capacity of policymakers to review policy debates about the issue is doubtful. There are also budget constraints that limits any possible efforts. As noted in the public universities, given the current constraints, professors, policymakers, and policy entrepreneurs agreed that the best solution can be giving more autonomy to faculties to effect their own accommodation according to the quantity and quality of students they have. One issue that was raised by the private two also is to have inclusion as one of the criteria for accreditation. And another thing was the accommodation, the level of accommodation needed. So the private universities called for accommodation on the ministry level, yet the public one thought that it could be only affected on the faculties level, and public two thought that it should be affected on the faculties and the university as a whole. Next, please. So we now defined the problem. We talked about the solutions suggested. So we're moving our attention to the factors or the politics that affect the problems and the solutions. Next, please. So all 4 universities agreed that since 2018, the national mood has strongly enforced inclusion. Yet some more efforts are still needed to arrange the government dynamics. Yet again, the absence of common understanding of inclusion on the politics level is confusing everyone. So the one common ground everyone expressed is to position inclusion as a priority to trigger everyone's interest to work towards it. And next, please. So discussions here went around the expected role of having a mentorship and peer support system to agree on common grounds of inclusion. Different interventions were suggested, as we can see, but the key about effecting any was about the best use of time, cost, and manpower. So the overarching direction was about maximizing the impact of any potential intervention by knowing and learning from the past and identifying current possible peer supporters. So public one, for example, called for the knowledge hubs, public two called for the gap analysis, and private one thought that the politics should force the simultaneous targets for inclusion and not only students with disabilities. Private two thought that politics should use the liberal arts to enhance and change the social relationships and to make sure that students with disabilities are fully accepted. Next, please. So politics again, and on the institutional level in all the 4 examined higher education institutions, linking inclusion to professors' promotion and contractual agreement was another key dimensional area of discussion. With the current status, the public universities link professors' promotions to community service, but not to inclusion. The private one link and is officially evidenced in the agreements, and inclusion is one of the criteria that they are assessed every year against it. In the private two, no official link, yet the management structure enforce inclusion. Next, please. So again, with the politics on the community level, while different collaboration mechanisms were identified by each university to enhance the community political interest in inclusion, some were already in place and others were made as suggestions. So for example, the public one valued the importance of having a national community dialogue, a diagnostic action to know where we stand. Private one, for example, mentioned that the theory of change of community acceptance of inclusion, they usually examine the weakest underlying assumption in the suggested links and work on having partnerships to resolve such issues. So for example, they said that one of the weakest assumptions that they worked on was that students with disabilities can easily get enrolled in private universities, while this was a weakest assumption because private universities' tuition fees is really high. So they worked on it by doing partnerships to offer scholarships dedicated only for students with disabilities. So they see that the politics should enforce solutions for the weakest assumptions. In the private too, they thought that the politics should work on partnerships with the public, private, civil stakeholders in order to engage in joint research to innovative solutions and not traditional solutions. Next, please. So again, politics on the public policy level. All 4 universities agreed on the importance of having laws and regulations that focus on possible interdependence, adaptation, cycling of resources, and succession as a framework for harnessing inclusion, research, and intervention. All 4 universities agreed that rules and regulations should be revised across all educational settings and not only in higher education institutions. So public one, for example, called for the review of laws in regards to the persons with disabilities and the regulation of acceptance. Public two called for facilitating the implementation, not reviewing and facilitating the implementation. And private one called for learning from comparative models. And private two thinks that the politics should take the SDGs as a guiding manual for effecting social cohesion. So by this, we're reaching the 4th question. Next, please. So we're reaching the fourth research question. Does the multiple streams framework founded approach offer advantages over current policymaking approaches? Next, please. So I would say that policy change may not lead to desired results if the process of implementation is omitted from consideration. While there are other policymaking approaches like the advocacy coalition framework, policy learning, institutional change, and others, using this specific framework is really important and gave advantage to the higher education institutions because it considers the process of implementation and the factors of consideration across the implementation journey. So for example, because Egypt doesn't have up till now an inclusion strategy, so the framework focused on the development of inclusion policy agenda setting. And again, because the policy stakeholders' capacities to conceptualize inclusion still needs further enhancement. So the framework highlighted the policy stakeholders' understanding of the inclusion problem, policy, and politics. And also because we're a developing country with budget constraints, so the framework worked on unfolding the ecological constraints to prioritize the budget spending. And finally, because there is in consideration to the critical assumptions and the manageable interests, which is things that is outside our control and things that we need support from outsiders. So the framework has intentionally measured the politics stream from internal and external perspectives, investigating possible spillovers across different items. So we can identify what threatens the efforts and what needed to be done in collaboration with others outside the institutional, the higher education institutions. Next, please. So this, I'm finally reaching the conclusion. So I came up with only 4 conclusions up till now because I'm still drafting this section. So first, as evidence in the literature, there's a huge diversity in the policy issues that policy entrepreneurs care about. And it also evidence in the literature that policy entrepreneurs should have specific attributes that enhance their skills and thus allow them to use specific strategies. Next, please. In Egypt, all the 4 policy entrepreneurs that I met were of very high calibers with extensive working experience in the political sphere. A common observation is that they had both short-term and long-term plans designed to grow their benefits. They balance between their benefits, the current problems as far as they understand, and the return on investment of any possible solutions. 3 out of the 4 that I've met admitted that inclusion has been an issue since over 15 years, but they were never working on it and they never had the chance to convince the policymakers of it because the higher education institutions in Egypt had different or more prioritized issues than inclusion, like the quality of the education, the professor-students ratio, and so forth. So they admitted that now, given that students with disabilities voices are becoming more heard, and given the increased Egypt global commitments, the issue has become on the top of the list. So the policy window nowadays is easier to be opened in comparison to previous times, not only because of the policy entrepreneurs' efforts, but because of the context. So the real challenge now is about seeking the opportunity and not opening the policy window. So open policy windows is really becoming more easy, but it's about how to seek this opportunity of an opened window. Next, please. As evidence in the literature also, policy entrepreneurs' practices may be restricted in some cases by policymakers. There is a path dependence not allowing the entrepreneurs to effect the change without the endorsement of the government officials. That said, the policy entrepreneurs' efforts must be coupled with the government officials' efforts as well to be able to reach policymakers. Next, please. So in 3 out of 4 universities, policy entrepreneurs struggled in problem framing because of the accessibility to policymakers. And since problem framing is about having the policy entrepreneurs frame specific conditions to be seen as public problem and work to make policymakers accept these frames, yet still the main barrier always for policy entrepreneurs that they are not necessarily on good terms with the policymakers, as in many cases, they are perceived as competitors or threateners to policymakers' positions. So the challenge here is about resolving the issue or the tension between the policymakers and the policy entrepreneurs. Next, please. The ideational lens means that ideas matter in the policymaking. So these ideas may change on a vertical level, bottom-up approach, or top-down, or on a horizontal level, interactions between the actors and factors that infuse the change. Next, please. Among, again, the 4 examined higher education institutions, we had only one polycentric governance and the other were monocentric. So the polycentric, it has several governing authorities at different scales, while the monocentric with a single governing authority at the center. One of the important inclusion barriers in Egypt is policymakers' domination of ideas where they hardly listen to other opinions or give any space for creativity. So the challenge here is about enhancing more polycentric governance of higher education institutions. And the final conclusion, next please. If policy entrepreneurs fail to convince policymakers to put the inclusion problem on their agenda, they go for the convincing, I would say, the second level and make the change on the institutional level or the community level instead of the policy level. So next, please. So among the examined 4 universities, it was noted that the likely possible changes in the educational setting happens during the accreditation process. And because it reviews the quality of higher education institution programs, policymakers can get convinced to define specific conditions as a problem. As evidence in the literature, when inclusion is listed among the accreditation criteria, inclusion can be easily added to the policymaker's agenda. In Egypt, the accreditation is provided in two forms, the institutional and the programmatic. Institutional for the universities and faculties, and programmatic for the programs and departments and schools. So as we can see, most of the public examined universities have either institutional accreditation or no accreditation. And one of the private follows the same pattern, yet the private one university, which was acknowledged with an enhanced inclusive environment, holds double accreditation, national and international. By comparing these cases, we will find that the policy entrepreneurs face obstacles to open a policy window on the policy level. So they work on opening a policy window on the institutional level, which gives limited spectrum of influence, yet still it represents a mutual benefit for policy entrepreneurs and policymakers in terms of gaining accreditation to specific programs, and it would be a good start as a milestone in effecting a change on the policy level. So the challenge here is that thinking and working politically around the issue of inclusion could take longer time than what is expected. And I will stop here, and I'm open for any questions, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ola. That was really fascinating, and so much work has gone into that. Sorry, my dog is struggling as I start to speak. There we go. So it was fascinating to hear where you've got to with all of that. Opening the floor then, if you'd either like to switch on your camera and unmute yourself, or if you want in the chat area, have you any questions or comments for Ola? Perhaps I could kick off while people gather their thoughts. I'm just looking at the chat thing here. It sounds a bit depressing in terms of the policymakers, doesn't it, really? They basically don't listen, it sounds. It's from your data. You said quite early on in the talk, and this is a quote, about the multiple streams framework. Hopefully, they'll be used by policymakers when developing inclusion policies later on. That sounds a bit of a stretch from what you said later on, doesn't it? Is there any way that you could assist to scaffold the use of the framework, which obviously you found very valuable?
Yeah, actually, I think they will start because the sounds of the students, the voices of the students with disabilities and the Egypt commitments is really increasing. So I think they started thinking about the three streams separately and how they can come together. And also policy entrepreneurs, although they have this tension with the policymakers, I think also their influence is becoming very high, given that they are the ones who has the ability to invest. So they need this power, the policymakers need this power. So I believe they will be starting using this framework later on. And from the discussion specifically with policy entrepreneurs, they felt that the issue is about, again, the focus and the timing. And given that they started already resolving some higher priorities like the quality of education and other issues that was on their agenda. So the focus is more or less shifting to inclusion. So I hope that by time they will be able to use this. Yeah.
Okay, great. As a question from Amanda, point, my monitor is about to turn itself off, it says. So if I disappear for a second, that's why. Oh, and there we go. Okay, back again. Learned so much from presentation in relation to the way you presented your research in a clear, methodical and systematic way. Yeah, nice. And John Taylor, fascinating presentation. Could you say a little more about the student voice? What were their experiences? What were their priorities? Interesting question.
Yeah, sure. So the student voices, well, in Egypt, usually the student voices wasn't much heard, but nowadays, because we have this partnership and we have, again, this global commitments, so we have different channels currently in higher education institutions where students can reflect on what they need and I would say highlight their objections. So for example, in the private universities, the unions and the clubs are working very well and they have very sounded effect on the management. In the public universities, which is the most challenging, usually we didn't had students with disabilities in the clubs and the unions, specifically in the student unions, which is much more influential in public universities. But currently, because the number of students with disabilities has been really high in recent years. So they started, I would say, somehow being presented in the unions, and they are allowed to have access to the policymakers. So, and also the social media is playing a great role, and the national mood since 2018 started to give some attention to them. So I would say, I wouldn't say it like, you know, I'm trying to say it in a political way, but again, students with disabilities now, they somehow represents a threat on the management of the higher education institutions. So they need specific things and they are on top of things until these needs will be done. And the priorities of the students with disabilities, just answering the second part of the question, their priorities was mainly in the infrastructure. So this was the first thing that was discussed, and then followed by the ebooks. And it's not relevant to the COVID pandemic, it's relevant to their mobility and the cost that they have to bear to go to the universities. So these two things were really very much highlighted. And then the kind of support that they take from the TAs. So I would say that these were the three main things that they highlighted or prioritized.
Excellent, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments?
Hello.
Clara.
Hi, Clara.
Hello, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
I'm good. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really liked it, and I took into context the different disabilities that I come across within here in South Africa. Looking at different levels, the micro level, when you look at in the schools themselves, in the basic education, and then you go to higher education. Oh, my challenge is what were your observations, or your what did you get from in respect to teacher or agency in terms of disability within institutions? Because what I've seen in lecture rooms here in South Africa, specifically at the university that I am attending, yeah, the professors, the teachers, the agents, I'm not quite sure, because it's like maybe the expertise or the agents. What did you get from on that side?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a very good question, actually, and it's the setting is very different between the public universities versus the private universities. So I
Yes.
will start with the easy one first, the private universities. So the professors are very much, they have the small sections and they know all their students, and they do this accommodation based on specific criteria that they follow. And they actually have the time, and I would say that they are relaxed enough to deal with the challenges of the students with disabilities. And on the other side, on the the public universities, the structure and the setting is totally different. So the professors, they meet the students with disabilities very rare, or they meet the students in general very rare. And they have sections with the TAs or the assistant professors. So they do not meet the professors on regular basis. Also, the professors, usually they work in several faculties or several universities. So it's not necessarily that also they are available in the offices or have office hours or anything. So reaching out to professors is almost a dream in public universities, not only for students with disabilities, but also for all students. Yet the teaching assistants are very much into the topic and they are available, but again, they have limited authority and they cannot help much with other issues rather than just giving extra explanations, facilitating the process, explaining the assignments and so forth. But when it comes to exceptions, when it comes to exemptions from the curriculum and other exceptions, they do not have the authority. So I'm not sure whether I've answered your question, but let me know.
Yeah, I think you have answered it, because I was trying to attribute this to maybe to my specific space, which where I've done my research are the schools where I see learners with the disabilities, and you get into the classrooms, you are there, the teacher is there, but to a certain extent, you realize that it's maybe the expertise, how to handle the disability, which makes the teacher like lacking agency or something else. I don't know.
Okay, if I get you correctly, well, usually, well, for example, in the private one university, they handle them through different, I would say, facilitations inside the class. The class facilities are there, and they also give them like principal accommodations and customized accommodations. So they allow them different options. The room is open really for anything that is available as long as it's within the mandate of the university. But in public university, it's really very challenging for them because they can hardly reach the sections. And even when they go inside, the infrastructure is not there. There is no facilities and there is nothing. So even when the professors go, and even if any one of the professors feel committed to this disabled student, they cannot offer much because the time, the number of the students attending the session, and the facilities that is not there.
No, thank you so much for this has been a great research. I have learned a lot, and thank you for taking the bull by its horn. You know, this is a very important issue within institutions like the higher learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Staff-student ratios in the public universities sound to be very high compared to those in the private universities. Is that right?
Yeah, it's almost 6 times.
6 times, wow.
Yeah, yeah. And even the structure is different because, again, professors, they do not meet the students much. It's all about the assistant professors and the TAs. But in the private universities, it's all about professors. It's totally different. Yeah.
Right. But they've got far fewer students. A question from Amanda. How do you sell the benefits of inclusion to academics who are resistant due to time constraints, etc.? It's good question.
Yeah, actually, this is a very interesting question, and I've been thinking about it. I think, and I'm not sure, I'm still going into the analysis and the conclusion thing, but what I've heard from the professors in the public universities, and I was much keen about their perception at this point, because again, the pedagogical I would say, direction is going for the project-based learning and the problem-based learning. So they are trying as much as they can now to make the assignments as project-based. So this would help them actually, I would say, get benefit from the participation of everyone. So this is when the students with disabilities value or the contribution of students with disabilities is valued in the project-based learning, because they can do some tasks that others cannot do. So I would sell the inclusion, the benefits of inclusion to the academics by having them on board facilitate the new direction of the project-based learning and of the dynamics inside the class. And because also they have been complaining much from the, as we said, the huge number that they teach, and they are now convinced that the project-based learning would help them make things easier and lessen the burden on them during these sessions. So I think this is the key thing where we can sell inclusion, that it would help with the new instructional strategies they are willing to use.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry. Yeah, I hope, Amanda, that I've answered your question. Thank you.
Someone said they didn't get that. I don't know whether that was a technical issue.
Yeah, this is why my Apple Watch. Sorry.
Oh, was it the Apple Watch?
Yeah.
Okay. Electronic voice.
Exactly.
Sorry, Apple, that you didn't get it. We were all fine.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh dear, post-humanism. Hey. Yeah, it's totally disrupted my train of thought now, but it's a very interesting question and a really interesting answer. Oh, it was about accreditation. That's right. And the sort of critical points of accrediting institutions and programs that you were talking about. I mean, I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it worked very well in the private one university. And I think in the public, they are now concerned about the partnerships, which also increase the possibility of accreditation. Maybe they are more focused on the national accreditation for the meantime to go later on to the advanced accreditation. But again, yes, as you're saying, Paul, I think that accreditation would also sell the inclusion concept well, because it will allow them to review the quality that they are providing. And again, to make it integrated into the system. But I have to admit that professors are not happy being assessed against inclusion in public universities. So I had this probe question about whether you would you accept being assessed against inclusion? So the answer was, we do not know what inclusion means. So just define it first, have it in the strategy, and give us professional development on it, and then later on let's be assessed against it. So they were very, I would say, aggressive about it here. But the policymakers were very much into the accreditation, and they think sincerely that it should go within the criteria of accreditation.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a little opening, or a big opening for the issue to be actioned. Yeah. Any further questions or comments? If not, I will close the session. Okay, looks like not. So once again, many thanks, Ola, for today. It's been high intensity with a lot of work behind it. And very interesting. I think everyone's enjoyed it and learned from it. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor Paul, and thank you for all your guidance throughout the journey. And I hope that when I finish all the chapters, you will find it very useful. And I hope that the Egyptians policymakers would be able to make use of it.
So do I. On the last point, absolutely, yes. Wonderful. Just to say finally that the next online seminar will take place on what I like to call Star Wars Day, May the 4th, be with you, 2022. And it's Morten Hansen, who's a research associate in the Department of Educational Research here at Lancaster. Or should I say there at Lancaster. Okay, so thanks everyone for attending, and yeah, see you next time. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye.